I'm honored to be joined again by Dr. Mark Solms. He is a neuropsychologist, psychoanalyst, and professor at the University of Cape Town, and author of The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness, which is, without a doubt, the best book of consciousness I've read, and overall one of my favorite science and philosophy books. Mark, great to have you back on the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Great to be back, Adam, and thanks for those nice words about my book. That book is the culmination of my life's work. So if that one didn't go, then I have nothing to offer.
It's impossible to overstate how influential it's been on me. I mean, we met when I was in undergrad studying cognitive science. And, as you talk about in your book, and we've talked about during some of our meetings over the years off camera, you still see this really corticocentric view, especially in psychology. And what was really influential to me, the animal research that you point out, and this hidden spring, I mean, we spent a whole earlier podcast talking about it. The title was a mystery to me at first, but the hidden spring you mentioned refers to this sort of hidden source way deep in the brainstem being the source of consciousness rather than our cortex in the front of our brain, right?
That's correct. I frequently am misunderstood on this point. So I'm glad to have an opportunity just to clarify. I am not saying, this is the part that gets misunderstood. I'm not saying the cortex is not important for consciousness, or, that we can do without the cortex and we'd be just the same. What I'm saying is the following, that first of all, which is not controversial, first of all, that there would be no consciousness without reticular activating system arousal. In other words, the reticulate core of the brainstem is a prerequisite for any form of consciousness. That's the first thing I'm saying. The second thing I'm saying, which is controversial, but I'm not the only one who says it, and the evidence for it is overwhelming. It's that this prerequisite brainstem arousal is not just a matter of a light switch or a volume control knob, that it's got something to do with the quantitative level of consciousness. It does have to do with the quantitative level of consciousness, but not only that. It has to do also with a quality and a content of consciousness, which we call affect. So in other words, the prerequisite for all other forms of consciousness is felt affective arousal. That's really important, because if we accept, as everyone does, that it's prerequisite, and if we accept, as the evidence overwhelmingly shows, that it generates raw affective feelings, then it means that raw affective feelings are the foundation of all consciousness. The third thing that I'm saying is that the cortex, its functions are intrinsically unconscious. In other words, the intrinsic functions of the cortex, the cortical, cognitive, perceptual, memory, etc. functions, they are not fundamentally conscious processes. They go on in the dark, to quote David Chalmers. They go on in the dark all the time. All of these cognitive processes do not require consciousness in order for them to happen. So they only become conscious to the extent that they are modulated by reticular activating arousal. I like to put it like this, that we feel our way into our cognitions. We feel our way into our perceptions. To that extent, we become conscious of what are otherwise unconscious processes. So the last thing to say, the fourth thing, is the question then becomes, what is it that feeling your way into your cognitions adds? In what way are those cortical processes enhanced by our being aware of? And I think it works like this, that the fundamental function of consciousness is for us to know how well or badly we're doing in terms of meeting our needs. In other words, how well or badly we're doing in terms of our perennial task of remaining in homeostasis. This is an absolutely inescapable task of any living thing, that it has to remain in homeostasis. Now, I say living thing, I'm including plants. Every living thing needs to remain within its phenotypic viable bounds. And all living things are equipped with mechanisms for doing that, which we, to speak loosely, call reflexes. In other words, autonomic, automatized mechanisms that reflexively return us to our viable bounds. What feeling adds is that when it doesn't work, then the organism can only behave randomly. Feeling tells you whether that random behavior is making things better or worse. That's the essence of what it's there for. So feeling tells you, carry on doing this, stop doing that. This is working, that's not working. That's what valence is. Valence, positive or negative valence. Negative valence means you're going the wrong way. Positive valence means you're going the right way. And then it also has a particular quality, because we have multiple needs. So you need to know, in relation to which of my needs am I out of my viable bounds, and in relation to that one, that's the one I'm feeling, I need to know how well or badly I'm doing. The ability to do that underwrites the capacity for choice. That's what I've just described. I'm not going to do that because it's not working. I am going to do this because it's working. In other words, it underwrites voluntary action as opposed to automatic action, as opposed to reflex. And that's no small thing. That capacity for choice, in turn, leads to learning from experience. In other words, the next time you find yourself in that same uncertain situation, you now have a prediction as to what to do and what not to do. So that's the essence of what cognition is. It's predictive work. It's learning how to meet my needs in uncertain situations. And the functionality that feeling adds is the capacity to not just be at the mercy of the vagaries of natural selection. Do I happen to do randomly the right thing, and therefore survive? No, it's not random. I'm able to learn from it. I'm able to feel my way through it and thereby to learn from it. And this makes me able to survive in unpredicted contexts, in contexts which are not predicted by my genotype. The other question that arises, sorry, I'm giving you a hell of a long answer to what I'm not even sure was a question. The other thing that is important to draw attention to is that there's a difference between the feeling, which drives the predictive work, and the predictive work itself, which is the cognition. And the consciousness that attaches to that predictive work has to do with the modulation of confidence in a particular policy. So it's a palpating of, okay, I'm expecting this to follow from that action. Now that isn't what followed, so I now palpate the error. I have confidence in this error signal, so I'm losing confidence in that policy, so I'm changing that policy. That's not leading to as much precise error, so now I increase my confidence in that policy. So cognitive consciousness, the feeling of our way through what we're doing in the world, is this business. That's what I mean by predictive work. And it has a different quality from the feeling because it is the work demanded by the feeling. The feeling is the demand. The work so demanded is the cognitive work.
Everything we discussed up to the point of affect being fundamental to consciousness right before the prediction and learning and confidence intervals calculated around error bands, all of that is really well grounded in basic affective neuroscience from animal research and human brain damage. People like Jaak Panksepp and Antonio Damasio are well represented in this camp. And then at the other extreme, you have this modern cognitive computational take that you were referring to, where people almost seem to sidestep affect. They assume that what the brain is doing are these computations. The brain is a predictive machine, and it's aiming to minimize uncertainty and maximize some sort of value. But I think they often skip over the idea that whatever this expected utility, this value is that you're maximizing, that's intrinsically affective or qualitative. And what your work does really nicely is explicitly bridges these two together, particularly your work with Carl Friston and integrating predictive processing and active inference directly into what is affect and computationally grounding this idea of positive or negative affect and arousal in terms of entropy and prediction error.
Yes, thank you. I agree that that's what I do in bridging those two domains, affective neuroscience and computational neuroscience. But I want to point out that it's not a like an interesting take on computational neuroscience, or a sort of nice to have add-on, or an extra thing that we can say or do using computational neuroscience. I think it is absolutely fundamental to that framework. In other words, when you say that the organism or the agent is minimizing its uncertainty in its predictions, which is what that's all about. That whole school of thought, the active inference framework grounded in the free energy principle. Why is the agent doing that? You know, to quote, I forget what his name was. It was somebody who Dan Dennett introduced me to, a philosopher who said, computers don't give a damn. So
Mhm.
why do these agents give a damn? You know, why are they bothering to do this predictive work? It's because they are absolutely obliged to. Any self-organizing system, the very essence of a self-organizing system is that it is self-organizing in order to continue to exist as a system. So that's all of this predictive processing, in other words, trying to organize myself in such a way that I can reliably predict the consequences of my actions. It's so that I perform actions which ensure that I continue to exist as a system. So that whole framework of active inference is actually predicated upon the principle that governs the affective neuroscience side of things that I've grafted together with it. It is a natural relationship. It's not an interesting bridge that I'm building between two domains. I think that it's a realization that those two domains are actually speaking to the same problem. And you mentioned my work with Carl Friston. To illustrate anybody who's interested enough in what we're talking about, they should take a look at a paper that Carl Friston wrote in 2013 called Life as We Know It. It was published in a journal of the Royal Society called Interface. And there he says everything that I've just said, except he doesn't mention affect, you know, but he points out that the basic reason why such systems function in such a way is fundamentally in order for them to remain within their viable bounds. In other words, in order for them to maintain homeostasis. Hence that lovely title, Life as We Know It. I mean, this is the mechanism of how living things remain living things. It's the driving force of the whole of biology. Biological systems perforce must work like this. So that's the connection between them. But interestingly, when I first met Carl, which was in 2013, if I remember correctly, you know, he was like all of them. He was just talking about cortex. It was just assumed when you start speaking about the predictive work that the brain does, that the brain is a predictive machine, they just automatically start talking cortex. And you know, it was a kind of an eye opener to him when I started saying, but hang on a minute, these homeostatic functions, which are fundamentally what's driving all of this, they're not performed by the cortex. they're performed by brainstem structures. And the very brilliant mind that he is, of course, was open to that. And now it's no longer true to say that people working in that framework are only thinking cortex and are neglecting the affective side. It's now become rather fashionable to do that. So I'm very pleased to see that it's the computational architectures are anything but disembodied in the way that many people are thinking about today.
That was really surprising to me, given some of the lesion studies that you talk about in your book, where you could have the entire cortex removed and an animal is still able to go about at least operating on basic feeling and reflex. But if you lesion just a small area of the brainstem, you're instantly brain dead.
Yes. So it's important to emphasize that what the animal does, you just said it, but I want to emphasize it. What the animal does, these are decorticate mammals. No cortex at all, cortex removed at birth. And what they do is they fight, they freeze, they flee. Inappropriately, in dangerous situations, they freeze and flee. In frustrating situations, they attack. They play, play with each other. A whole lot of decorticate rats play with each other. They copulate with each other. They give birth to their young and then they nurture them. All of that imperfectly, but they do it. So all of the inclination to do these things, the affects that incline us to do things like copulate and play and fight and so on, are present in these creatures. Now, they don't do a hell of a lot of cognitive stuff like we do. So it's not as great a loss to their functionality to lose cortex as it is to a human being. But the equivalent happens in human beings. Of course, there's never been an experiment to remove the cortex of a human being, but there are children who are born with no cortex. And we observe exactly the same thing in them, that all of these basic emotional inclinations in situationally appropriate fashion are displayed. And conversely, again, as you've said about the animal lesion studies, in human beings with naturally occurring lesions, the minimum amount of damage in the human brain that reliably leads to coma is 2 cubic millimeters, the size of a match head, in a part of the reticular activating system called the parabrachial complex. You can obliterate consciousness with lesions elsewhere in the reticular activating systems, and again, pretty small lesions, but the smallest one is only 2 cubic millimeters in extent. Fisher and colleagues who studied this speak of it as a coma-specific region, just 2 cubic millimeters in extent.
There's this idea of thinking about the brain in terms of an evolutionary hierarchy. So brainstem is most ancient, and you're going to see it in all vertebrates, pretty conserved. And then you go up to the limbic system and you see that across more complex mammals. And then getting to cortex, it's more fleshed out specifically in social mammals or social species. And some people criticize that as an overly simplistic take, but this idea of brainstem being most evolutionarily ancient and for any organism to have evolved and have any preferences whatsoever, any form of valence that can enable learning, like knowing the difference between food and threat. Do you tend to think about that in the same evolutionary way of the most fundamental regions must be the oldest?
I do, but I need to qualify that answer. The criticism that has been leveled at that view is mostly directed at Paul MacLean. Paul MacLean's idea of a triune brain, that there's this, this reptile brain, and then there's this mammal brain, and then there's this human or primate brain. When he did that little model, he himself said, um, of course, this is a simplification. It's just getting across a basic point. So, of course, it's a simplification. And so now, when I say I need to qualify what I'm saying, when I say I agree with that view that there is a stratification in the brain, and that stratification follows evolutionary chronology. What that means is that the brain stem is the most similar part of the brain between us and all other vertebrates. In other words, the basic plan of the brain stem is the same in a lizard and in a human being. This is a remarkable fact, but it is. The same nuclei, more or less, are there, connected to each other, more or less the same way. So that cannot be said of their higher brain. It's true that they do have a forebrain, but its organization is radically different from ours. And it's much smaller. It's just like a little nub of what will become the forebrain. And so I say what will become, there's a problem here, because of course modern day lizards are on the same evolutionary uh, chronological moment as we are. So it's not that a lizard is going to become a human being. We have a common ancestor, and that common ancestor, it didn't vary as much in the lizard as it did over that same time period, as it varied, as it changed, as it developed in the evolutionary sense in us. It developed whole new expanse of forebrain, and that applies in particular to a whole new expanse of cortex. So there's a little pallium there, but it is massively expanded in the mammal, and even more so when it comes to cortex in the primate. So there's one caveat I've already made. I'm saying it's not that literally the lizard brain becomes the rat brain becomes the human brain. It's that the basic blueprint of how to make a brain gets in this lot, doesn't get extended in this upward direction as it does in that lot. We're this lot. The other caveat, and the last one, is that, of course, when new layers are added, in other words, when there's this efflorescence, I don't know what to call it, a sort of an unfolding and expansion of structures which are minimally evolved in lower vertebrates. Of course, it's not only adding, it's also reorganizing in the process of adding. So to point to the most important such reorganizing principle, of course, the higher structures then have a top-down influence over the lower structures, which is absent in those lower structures in the lizard, for example. So the brainstem works in a somewhat different way, because it's now got additional top-down regulatory and inhibitory and feedback mechanisms and so on. So to come back to my starting point, it's true. It's also true that it's a simplification, but it's a very useful simplification. I think it is a truly that's the one thing that I said in my little answer now to your comment, which I want to repeat, is that I think it is a really, really remarkable fact that the basic layout of the brainstem in the human being is the same as the basic layout of the brainstem in the fish or the lizard, and that they basically do the same thing. With those caveats added.
The one thing we could conclude from that, I think, then, is that all vertebrates at least have some basic source of consciousness, even if it's only reflexive, like responding to reward or threat. But you and I have become familiar with Mike Levin's work, and he studies even simpler animals, including some without a central nervous system, like these tiny little flatworm planaria. Actually, they do have a simple central nervous system, but they can learn, they can do basic classical conditioning. Not only that, you can cut off their head and they can regrow a new head, so it's different matter, and they retain the learning. So there's something about that memory is stored. I don't know where it's stored really, but there's some connection there that this evolutionary story, it's not only true from the level of vertebrates onwards, but even to the simplest oceanic life you can think of billions of years ago, there must have been some primitive learning mechanisms that enabled these later branching that we were just talking about.
Yeah. I want to divide what you said into two parts. You made a small little preface, and then you made a bigger comment about Mike Levin. I want to not skip over the small little preface, which is that if we have basically the same brain stems, and I've already said what the brain stem does, then it means that the brain stem of a fish must do that too. It's not just an inference; it is an hypothesis that one can test experimentally. The answer every time that we do an experimental test of predictions arising from the hypothesis that this brainstem architecture is the architecture for raw feeling and for learning from experience in novel situations. In other words, coming up with new ideas that were not built into um, your innate phenotypic repertoire of reflexes and instincts. Every time we test those predictions, the the answer comes back yes, they do the same thing. And that includes, I can't resist adding, inserting here uh, a test of the um, a prediction arising from what we know in humans, that these functions are actually felt. It's very hard to know. Well, so it's performing the same functions, but does it really feel like anything to be a fish? Um, this study, which as I say, I can't resist mentioning, which has got to do with hedonic place preference behavior, where zebrafish or zebrafish, as you guys call them, they hang out on this side of the cave of the tank because that's where they get food, and then you put onto this side of the tank, you put cocaine or morphine or nicotine or amphetamine, and what do you see? The prediction is if zebrafish have feelings, they'll go for the cocaine, because the only thing that's good about cocaine is that it feels good. It's not nutritional; it's in fact harmful to you. And the same applies to the other substances. And the answer is yes, that's what they do. That's what's hedonic place preference behavior. In other words, they prefer to be the place where the happy feelings are. So that's quite amazing. So as I said, I don't want to skip over that prefatory remark of yours because I think it's important.
I've got
Um,
another anecdote to introduce there, and then we can return to the broader Mike
okay.
Levin point. So I was reading a lot about prairie voles recently and how oxytocin mediates attachment and pair bonding. And they use almost an addiction model. So talking about how the love hormone oxytocin couples with the dopamine system, and what's really happening when a monogamous prairie vole first mates, you see this huge spike in oxytocin and also a spike in dopamine. And it's framed as if it's an addiction model, like kind of how if you take some drug and you get this huge spike of dopamine compared to anything else in the world that's rewarding to you, you're going to form this intensely strong learned association with the drug, and that's how addiction could result. And that was the hypothesis, which I think neurobiologically is reasonable, but it was interesting how it seemed to take out the subjectivity of it. Like the vole isn't experiencing something like romantic attachment and a genuine desire, but almost a compulsion. And then you could, even though it's much more complicated in humans, I think the same neurobiology is the same. But when we look at humans, we don't say it's just oxytocin and dopamine that cause you to fall in love and you become addicted to a partner and it's all mechanistic and outside of your control. We know there's a subjective element to love in humans, and even with evidence that it's more or less the same in other mammals, including rodents, for some reason, people are reluctant to say those prairie voles are experiencing something like love.
Yes. Uh, it's amazing, the prairie voles. I'm glad that you know about them because they are uh, very social creatures, and they form. Uh, they have very strong attachment systems. What we're talking about is attachment. That's what you're talking about. And you say we don't say in humans, that the only reason that you're with your partner is because he or she gives you a dopamine rush. You know that there's actually a relationship, that you feel something and that there's a need for it in us. We can't know that that's the case in other animals. Um, but, in science, all you can ever do is set up falsifiable predictions based on reasonable hypotheses. So, that's the kind of thing I was saying about the fish. um, Harlow's work with monkeys spoke to the issue that you spoke experimentally. In other words, tested hypotheses relating to the issue that you're speaking about, when he showed that the monkey, the baby monkey, um, when it has two surrogate mothers, uh, both made of wire. One of them has a bottle that provides milk, and the other one, all that it provides is a soft uh, surface for it to cling to and hang on to. Um, what Harlow showed is that um, although this is the one that gives the dopamine rush in the sense of meets my need, satisfies my hunger, I have another need, which is that I need to hold on to mummy. That's the beginnings of an attachment bond. And that's what he found. If it was just, actually, it's all just based on a more primitive need. There isn't this higher social need. Then Harlow's baby monkeys would have just stayed with the bottle. They wouldn't have left the bottle, which they do. They spend more time clinging to the monkey with the terry cloth, the wire monkey with the terry cloth, which gives it some semblance. I mean, the poor thing, of course, it's dreadful. These experiments are dreadful, but it showed that it had that kind of need. Um,
There's a professor in my department who calls herself wire mother, as in, I'm going to give you harsh feedback, but this is the milk you need to grow into a successful scientist. Better to do that than to be cloth mother, who's going to make you feel nice in the moment, but not really give you what you actually need to survive and thrive.
yeah. So, we speak of anthropomorphism and the moral fallacy and so on. Of course, there's a risk of these things, but there's also a risk of absurd skepticism. When the evidence um, so strongly suggests that these animals do, in fact, prairie voles. I wouldn't hesitate to say that they are attached to each other in with feelings of warm, fuzzy, nice. I'm happy because I'm together with my attachment figure. I think the evidence much more strongly suggests that that's what's going on than that they are zombies. Um, Now, let's come back to Mike Levin. As you can see I'm speaking now to our audience, from what Adam and I are saying, uh, this is not something, the fact that voles and other rodents have an emotional life is not something that is widely accepted. It's not as if I'm some sort of maverick. There's a very large number of scientists, especially the ones who actually work with these animals, who actually know something about them. Uh, they're quite happy um, to speak in the terms that I'm speaking. They're quite happy now, not in the 70s, but from the 80s and then into the 90s and now into our century. So it's becoming, there's an increasingly large number of animal researchers who do acknowledge that these creatures have feelings. Not exactly the same type of consciousness as us, but they have these feelings. They have these raw feelings, including social feelings, feelings like rage and fear and attachment. and its opposite, in other words, separation, distress, and despair, and all of these sorts of things. But now, when you speak about Mike Levin, the problem is compounded, because if you have a hard time persuading your colleagues that a rodent has feelings, then you're really going to have a hard time persuading anybody that a simple worm has feelings too. So I was alarmed as I got to know Mike Levin's work. I thought, oh my God, I'm already up against such resistance just trying to persuade my colleague that anything with a brainstem is going to have raw feelings. Now he's saying, well, why are you not willing to attribute feelings to my little worms? I am open to that, open to it, and I want to preface my openness by saying by providing two bookends to that openness. In other words, it's not an unlimited openness. The one is to say that anything in nature evolves, and there is always a precursor of everything. So you go down and down and down and down and down till you get the simplest, most elementary form of feeling, the dawn of consciousness, if you will. And then prior to that, there must be something which is not yet a feeling, but it's pretty much, on the way to being there. It's a proto feeling. And do you get my point? So it's kind of like a logical point. There isn't a moment when, boom, suddenly you've got consciousness, and a moment prior to that where you got none. There's some kind of functionality which evolves gradually. The other bookend is that doesn't mean that I'm a panpsychist. It doesn't mean, well, then everything is a little bit conscious, even this table that I'm sitting in front of here. That's ridiculous. So I'm open to it, but not, it doesn't mean that everything has what is the term that Mike Levins uses, basal cognition. And I think there's some proto form of that basal cognition turning into something that's almost a feeling, and then something that's just a little bit of a feeling, maybe. And I've spoken to Mike about this, and I think it's a very plausible idea that there are creatures which have just moments of consciousness. Most of the time they're functioning entirely automatically. Then they're in a crisis, and then there's like this little flash of, feeling your way through the crisis, and then the rest of the time, it's all just monotonous. It's all just rote. But what is at stake here? When I listen to Mike, he says, well, there's there's cognition going on in these creatures. Well, what does cognition mean? It means problem solving, and it means learning. The evidence that he presents is overwhelming. They solve problems and they learn. And I've had several conversations with him about this. And by the way, they're online. I think he has a YouTube channel or something. If you Google his name and my name, you'll find a few videos of us having conversations about this. That the point that's never been clearly resolved in those conversations is, to what extent is it a matter of there are various pre-programmed potentialities, various things that these worms can do, and they try all of those different things out, and in this way solve a problem, as opposed to coming up with an entirely novel solution, coming up with a behavior which is not one of its pre-prepared what's available in the repertoire. Maybe not for this situation, but nevertheless, it's available in the repertoire. So I think that I start speaking about proto consciousness at that level when that's a transitional form. Yes, it's solving problems, but it's not coming up with an entirely novel behavior. And then, in creatures like plants, you see nothing of nothing. It's always only, you can always predict exactly what the plant's going to do. I mean, I'm slightly parodying it, but you know what I mean.
I think that that view is right. I've learned some of this from Randy Buckner, who you may know, early pioneer of neuroimaging alongside Friston, and helped popularize the function of the default mode network. So he's taught in his neuroanatomy class, we begin with C. elegans flatworms, which I believe are even simpler than the planaria that Mike studies. They've got
Well,
less than 100 neurons. The full connectome is mapped out, and the function of every single neuron is mapped out. And the behavioral repertoire is very rigid. And then moving up even to something as simple as a Drosophila fruit fly, they have real learning and real novelty. And somewhere the flatworms that we're talking about must exist in this sort of slider scale from completely rigid pre-programmed behaviors to these little blips of consciousness where maybe most of their behavior is pre-programmed, but they can occasionally engage in novel learning.
that's right. That's how I see it. Glad we're on the same page.
And we weren't 3 years ago, because I don't know if you remember this. I was very attracted to panpsychism. And this is before I knew as much about neuroscience, and I was mostly engaging with consciousness from this philosophy of mind perspective, like David Chalmers and others. And this very vague idea of consciousness as information processing I liked. And we talked about in our first podcast, integrated information theory, which is kind of like active inference, but minus the critical self-organizing part and minus the idea that whatever system you're considering has boundaries and there's an internal world and an external world with respect to the system, these Markov blankets. So with integrated information theory, you can entertain the idea that a thermostat is conscious, or really any piece of matter, like it contains information. And I don't throw that idea out completely, but kind of like what you said earlier, there's no self-organization. So at most, it can just be a blip of information or just moments of information across time, but nothing that structures it together. So it's kind of meaningless to talk about it as a system. But once you get a self-organizing system over time, that's how I reconciled those two views. So I didn't throw out the panpsychist sympathy, but there's it's kind of meaningless to talk about if you don't have a stream of consciousness. I don't remember the philosopher that came up with that term, but you can try to imagine being conscious without memory. Maybe instantaneously you could be, but if you can't remember what you were like or who you were the last instant, the whole idea kind of collapses if you don't have memory.
So it was James, I think, who it was William James, I think, whose term stream of consciousness, I think it was him who first used that phrase. I think that now you and I might have reached a first point of disagreement. I'm not of the view that you have to have memory in order to have consciousness. Although I agree with you that to speak of a stream, it's a matter of is the stream being observed? Does the subject of this consciousness have any subjective sense of the passage of time? I think that it wouldn't. There's a stream. If it has no memory, there's a stream. From the external observer's point of view, you can say it's conscious, then. But that doesn't mean that there's any continuity, any sense of the continuity of its conscious state. But I think that a creature that has feeling, but it has no capacity to remember. In other words, it would be a pathological specimen, because the whole point of feeling is in order to enable us to learn from experience. But I think that in principle, I can imagine an organism. And in fact, some of these hydranencephalic children, remember, they too are pathological specimens. Some of them might begin to resemble the situation that I'm describing, where they have feelings. They don't know what the feelings are about. They just have them. And they don't necessarily learn from the experience of having the feeling. They just have them. It's because the brainstem architecture for the generating of feelings is there, but the forebrain architecture for using them to learn from experience is not there. So I'm just making a nitpicking point, so we can pass over it unless it matters to you. I'm saying that I don't think that consciousness requires memory. That's all I'm saying. I like Tom Nagel's definition of consciousness, and it seems as if it's pretty much the closest thing that we have to a consensus definition. It's there's no consensus definition of consciousness, but the closest contender for that description, I think, is Nagel's. And he says an organism is conscious if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism, something it is like for the organism. So if you look at that definition, if you reflect on that definition, there's no necessity for memory in there. There can be something it is like to be a hydranencephalic child, something it's like to the child, without the child having any sense of its own continuity of being.
This is uncharted territory for me, but I think it would be useful to lean into. I have a hunch that we don't disagree on the facts, and I'm open to revising whatever words I'm using. So I'm not talking about long-term memory. I don't think I'm even talking about short-term memory spanning minutes or seconds. It's more like memory in the idea that if there's something that it's like to be an organism, so let's say you have some sort of interoceptive body map. Well, the idea for you to be able to localize a feeling to a specific place in your body, there must be some sort of memory, like the very fact that you have a map of your body and that that's a constant in your experience and that you're able to localize something, even if the feeling itself doesn't last and isn't remembered beyond that instantaneous blip. There must be some broader form of memory, maybe in a Mike Levin way of thinking about it, like there's something genetically pre-programmed about the organism's body map that enables conscious experience.
Yeah, I think that the way you put it at the end is the crux of it. I think that what we mean by memory, I mean, it's certainly possible to have a body map without having learnt it. Um, it's possible on the basis of natural selection. So that is memory um, in the in the phylogenetic sense, and it's not. I don't use that Lamarck would call that memory. I don't call that memory. I call that natural selection. So certainly the species learns in the sense of from experience, in the sense of those that did the wrong thing cop it and don't reproduce. Those that did the right thing survive and reproduce, and therefore the species learns to do this and not to do those other things. And so things like, and in fact, this it's amazing that there some very influential figures in contemporary cognitive neuroscience who don't agree with me on this, but I think the fact that we're born with different needs that feel different is to locate those needs. So that when I feel hunger, um, I'm locating the unpleasure that I'm feeling differently from when I feel thirst, or when I feel sleepiness, or when I feel suffocation alarm. Each one of those is, in a manner of speaking, locating the need in a body map. It's saying, this relates to this one of your bodily needs, this to that one of your bodily needs. And we don't, this is the thing, as I said, that remarkably some of my colleagues disagree with us, but I think we don't learn that. That just comes with the phenotype. Then, of course, there's supplementing all of that with learning in the sense of memory, that in the way that I think we should reserve the word for, in other words, ontogenetically acquired. But, as you've learned more and more neuroscience, you'll know, I don't need to tell you, that the interaction between, the whole thing um, the ontogenetics, it's not as if these are two separate things, that there's a very delicate dance between what is, I mean, this is the whole title of your podcast, between what comes innately, and what is acquired. I always love to tell my students, long-term memory, what could be more environmentally determined than your own model of the
Mhm.
world based on your own ideographic pathway through it. That's what your long-term memory is. Your long-term memory is the record of your individual passage through life. So that's the most environmentally determined part. But how long-term memories are laid down is through the activation of genes.
Mhm.
It's you can't separate the processes, of course.
Right. So on one extreme, we have our experience of memory, the stuff you have conscious access to. On the other extreme, there's just learning and memory in a very metaphorical sense over evolutionary spans of time. On somewhere in the middle is the idea of unconscious learning, like the ability to ride a bike. It's kind of just stored in your motor system once you do it. You don't necessarily need to have conscious access to it. An example of that, even closer to the evolved innate form, might be learning how to walk, especially the types of species that can do that immediately from birth. It's not like a human where you have to learn over the span of a couple years. And then for the types of epigenetic effects in very simple organisms, I'm not sure whether they're maybe more similar to the types of unconscious procedural memory. So that's where it gets really complicated. Like on one hand, you could say it's not real memory that belongs to the organism. It's just a set of naturally selected repertoires, behavioral repertoires, or some built-in plasticity that's environmentally determined, but there's not necessarily anything conscious about it. But I feel like there might be something here in reconciling this with that old controversial idea that memory is somehow stored in RNA that Mike has been trying to revive. And, with these flatworm studies, if you cut off their head and the literal physical material that the memory would hypothetically be stored in, if memories were stored in synapses, those are gone. So that doesn't make sense. But if while it learns, there's some sort of epigenetic switching going on that's encoded across the whole genome, and then growing new material is able to have the same memories encoded into it, it's certainly not learning in the conscious sense, and it might just be evolved and pre-programmed. But I wonder, is that like a more basic version of procedural memory that might be present in maybe even all life, or as simple of life as those which have any capacity to learn anything at all?
Yes, I'm very sympathetic to that view and to Mike's view. I think that it's entirely plausible. I want to though just pick up on one point. And sorry, you will have noticed that I had a slip of the tongue. I said ontogenetic instead of epigenetic a few minutes ago. Thanks.
It actually
Politely.
seemed like it worked. I was wondering if that was just a mix of ontology and epigenetics
I
specifically over a longer
Yeah, it
developmental
was a
scale. We
it
could
was
coin it in this podcast here if it didn't already
yeah.
exist.
I I think that I would. I called it a slip of the tongue, but maybe I should call it a slip of the mind, because it was that the exact the conceptual link you just made was where my head was going. That's why I I accidentally coined a neologism. Um, the I just want to pick up on this point, which is that, I mean, I really like what you were saying, but I want to add something. This is not to subtract from what you're saying. I think that a lot of what uh, goes into non-declarative memory systems was not non-declarative at the outset. In other words, while I'm solving a problem, I'm feeling my way through it. Once the problem is solved, then I automatize that prediction. I don't have to feel my way through it anymore, but it was derived from a felt process. Now, remember, I'm saying this is in addition to what you were just saying. I'm just wanting to make this point because I think it's important for cognitive scientists to speak of unconscious memory systems, to remember, first of all, the thing I've just said, that that many non-declarative predictions, as I call them, more non-declarative memories. Let me just quickly, as an aside, I like to say um, memories are about the past, but they're for the future. So this is why I use the word memory and prediction interchangeably, because the whole point of learning from past experience is to be able to better predict future experience. So what memories actually uh, are are, are predictions. Um, so um, the the point I was wanting to make is that many of these non-declarative predictions are derived from felt predictive work and then automatized once they become sufficiently reliable predictions that they no longer need to remain um, declarative. The second point is that many um, unconscious or non-declarative memory systems are only unconscious uh, in the literal sense of non-declarative. In other words, we're not cognitively conscious of them, but that doesn't mean that we don't feel them. So, for example, in this famous experiment where the participants are shown subliminally, in other words, unconsciously, with a tachistoscope, they're shown face A with the word rapist underneath and face B with the word philanthropist underneath, but they don't even know that they've seen anything. Then they're shown afterwards, face A and face B, and asked which one do they prefer. And they say, I have no preference. I don't know these guys. And then you say, well, it's a forced choice. You got to choose one of them. They choose face B. And that is unconsciously they've chosen face B. But that's not true. They felt a preference for face B. You know, they just don't know where that feeling comes from. So it's cognitively unconscious, but it's not affectively unconscious. It's affectively felt. So I just wanted to add those two things to what you were saying, that the non-declarative memory systems are sometimes derived from felt processes and which are no longer felt, and others of them uh, are operating non-declaratively only in the cognitive sense, but there is actually a declaration, as it were, of a feeling without knowledge of its source.
That makes me think of similar subliminal priming studies looking at threat response. So it's just for a few milliseconds flashing something like a gun or a snake on the screen, and people can't even consciously register it, but you will see these little bits of amygdala activity responding to it. So I might look at that and say, because they didn't even consciously perceive it, it doesn't count as a conscious experience. Are you arguing that because of that amygdala activity, there might just be a slight shift in affective arousal, and even if they can't pinpoint it, there is a subjective feeling associated with it?
Very much so. And the reason that I bothered to make this point, which might seem rather esoteric to some people, is that uh, uh, people who don't acknowledge the possibility or the probability of what you've just said, that you have a brief flash of something scary, you have a brief bit of scariness without having any idea where it came from. But nevertheless, you've learned from the the association of that feeling with that unconscious representation. Um, the people who don't acknowledge the probability that such things do happen, and who call that unconscious learning, they build a whole lot of theory on top of that. You know, some of them use that theory, in ways that actually matter to me. Like they say, it's clearly these processes that you're saying are due to learning from experience, and that this is the role of affect. And uh, clearly the same thing can happen without affect, because look, here's my experiment. It was entirely unconscious, so there was I'm saying, well, where, in what way is that unconscious? You know, and there you go.
So here's a place where I'm sympathetic to the constructed emotion theory, or at least the central claim that valence and arousal are more fundamental than emotions in the way that you think of them consciously. So this was when I was still in California and when I was applying to grad school. I was at the beach and I checked my phone and I got one of my first interview invites and I was excited about it kind of moderately. And it was before I went into the water. And then afterwards, I went into the water. It was really cold. You know, the interview invite season is around January. And then I come back and suddenly I'm much more excited about the interview. Nothing changed except my physiological arousal, but it was from that affective change that suddenly I cognitively reappraised this whole thing as much more exciting. And if it was in a different context, if it was something maybe mildly threatening, and then my arousal went up, I probably would have gotten more anxious. Like if I'm already anxious and I drink coffee, suddenly I'm cognitively constructing these, maybe more anxious, more paranoid thoughts. I don't remember the technical term for it, but it's like what your cortex is doing. It's generating predictions and almost rationalizing your feelings.
Well, I the story that you've just told, I completely agree that that is consistent with the constructed emotion account, and therefore I need to make clear what my uh, difference of opinion with the constructed emotion people is. It's not that constructed emotion doesn't happen.
Mhm,
Of course it happens. It happens all the time. I'm saying, but there's something more fundamental than that, which we're born with. So we start with something, and then, we gradually, through enculturation and socialization and so on, we have these much more complex forms of hybrid cognitive affective uh, uh, mental processes. So let me just make sure that you are not endorsing something which I find the most problematical about that way of thinking about emotion. You're saying, uh, you remember your starting point was,
mm,
you think that there is some sort of generalized um, domain general uh, affect system which it consists in just valence and arousal. Um, that's what you're saying, and then you're saying, because look, blah 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 blah. I'm saying, well, the part of that story that I find hard to accept is the following part. According to Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's the main proponent of this way of thinking, she says that we have what she calls a body budget. In other words, we're managing
mhm.
our bodily economy. In other words, there are all these quantities of various needs, and we have to satisfy those needs. So, in other words, we have to maintain homeostasis allostatically. We've got to do things in the world which we predict are going to satisfy our needs. Um, I'm saying absolutely yes. And that allostatic part of it, I absolutely agree that it happens. But this is the part that's weird. She says that all of those multiple different needs, they get summarized in something called affect, which has only valence and arousal. So all of the different needs lead to one affective state, uh, which is pleasure, unpleasure, high or low arousal. Then cognition's task is to work out what to infer what state of need am I in and what must I do about it. And all of that is based on learning from experience. In other words, all of that is constructed. All of that is based on your individual social and cultural history. So, um, why? So I spoke earlier about hunger versus thirst versus sleepiness versus pain versus a suffocation alarm. Why would all of those things get summarized into one? I'm in a negative state of high arousal. I don't now. I need to work out what it is, and then I have to do all of this cognitive work to try and infer which of my need states am I. It just doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. I mean, what I, I think that what's going on is that we have these needs. We need to prioritize them, and we feel them. Just a raw feeling. We don't know what that feeling is. We come to learn. Oh, that feeling is hunger, and that feeling is pain. But the feelings are there in the first place, and then we learn whether what we're doing is working or not. And we're also not born blank slates. We have predictions that we're born with. Remember, I said reflexes and instincts. So this feeling triggers that instinctual behavior, which the feeling tells me this need, triggers that instinctual behavior, and the feeling tells me whether it's working or not in that particular category of need. So the that's the I'm saying the learning process arises from each one of these categories of need, which is qualified by its own particular feeling. And of course, as we learn more and more complex, things, it's these needs conflict with each other. So we have to have predictions which deal with two needs, not just one, and we have to have predictions that deal with a whole distribution of needs. And so all kinds of higher order abstract thoughts and cognitions interwoven with complex affective experiences do arise, but they arise from this categorical bedrock.
Right.
The one more point I want to add is that because you can't attend to everything at once, most of your needs are relegated to automaticity, and one or two are the ones which I need to palpate my uncertainty in what I'm doing about this one. This is the one that's prioritized. It is, of course, possible to make mistakes in your prioritization. So I think that it is possible that you think, oh, I'm prioritizing that, when in fact, I'm prioritizing the other thing. I should be prioritizing the other thing. That sort of thing also, of course, does happen.
I'm certainly with you in the basic emotion camp that we have innate, distinct affects, which are qualitatively and subjectively different as well. I think I'm agnostic to the idea that there might be this generalizable, domain general arousal system, because now I don't know if I would believe that we have this generalized valence and arousal, and then you get top-down control over that picks amongst the various cognitive needs, or the innate, categorically distinct homeostatic needs. Certainly, we get something like that later in development once you get more executive control. I don't know if that part is innate or not, but I think that's something that the two theories don't necessarily disagree with. And then I think about the different competing affects, the fundamental basic emotions, in sort of this neural network way. Like they're each firing at certain rates, and maybe the one with the highest firing rate overall wins in that moment. And then once its needs are met, the firing rate is attenuated, and then it starts to build up again. I think all of that you can have without needing some grander constructed theory. But then the idea that we have such a thing as generalized arousal that could modulate every single one of those basic emotion systems, like just something like jumping into the cold ocean, like I mentioned, and then feeling not only excited and aroused in the physiological sense, but that having a spillover effect even to something as abstract of thinking about grad school admissions. That I'm wondering, how would you explain that? Is that something that the two theories are compatible in?
I think that there's um, a sort of subtle or ambiguous matter here, which is that certainly I agree that every affect, um, and I use the word differently from Lisa. So Lisa thinks affect means valence and arousal, the same thing all the time. I say affects, plural. I'm saying that there are different categories of affect. I think that they are innate categories of affect because we have innate, um, uh, we have a prior distribution of categorical needs that come with the phenotype. And I already told you why we need to feel those different needs in their own categories. Um, but across those categories, all affects share two properties. They all share the property of valence and arousal. So you see what I mean when I say it's a
Mm.
subtle or ambiguous kind of point. So they must all be tapping into something that is general, um, uh, but I think they tap into that general thing in a specific way. So they're using arousal mechanisms and they're using valence uh, in relation to their own categories. So in that way, if that's what it means to say that there's a domain general affect system, which has these um, dimensions um, of arousal and affect. If that's what it means, that the different categories are tapping into a common mechanism, I think not only is that acceptable, I think it's plausible. I think it's likely. Why does every affect have valence and arousal? There's something that's general to all affect. But I'm saying that what is also general to all affect is that it has quality. And so that leads to the second point, which is that this prioritization business, because you said something about the firing rates in the different circuits and so on. The prioritization business is rather complex. It can't just be a pure matter of uh, which need has the highest number on a Likert scale. You know, that's the one that I prioritize. And the anatomy of the part of the brain at issue also suggests what I'm about to say. It's a matter of needs, which need is greatest, and opportunities, what opportunity is currently available, and that speaks to the anatomical the periaqueductal gray, which is where I believe this prioritization of where the needs, all the needs are they registered, is the kind of like a massive assembly point of all residual homeostatic error signals descends upon PAG, but directly behind the PAG is the superior colliculi, which is a massively condensed sort of salience map of the state of the world. So it's a state of my needs and a state of the opportunities, and some sort of calculation is made between those two things. And as I said, also there can be miscalculations, and also there can be spillovers. I don't think that when I speak of categories, I don't mean silos. And that's also consistent with the way that our physiology works. I mean, when I say we have categories of need, they kind of it's kind of clear how something like hunger, um, it, and thirst and coldness, which are three different, there's three different affective variables there. It turns out that being close to mummy in the nest helps me with all three of those things. So, eventually what evolves is a need to be close to mummy. And
Mm-hmm.
there is a kind of an organic connection, because this is the point you and I were talking about a few minutes ago in this discussion. A new category of need arises, but it's not absolutely orthogonal to those other three categories of need that I said. I think there are kind of constellations that play out. I'm giving too simplistic a view if I give the impression that each one of these affects is a silo and that they don't um, bleed into each other, for want of a better word.
The main take home point for me from your two debates with Lisa was that however the distinct basic emotion circuits or brain systems are set up, it's pretty similar to how we have different sensory systems. And I remember there was a point near the end of the second debate with Lisa. She was saying, look, even our sensory systems, things that everyone regards as categorically distinct, it's not like evolution drew these rigid boundaries in the brain. We have one brain, and even neurons in the visual system versus in the olfactory system, they're fundamentally structured very similarly. One is responding to chemical changes driven by different chemicals in smell, and one is responding to chemical changes driven by light. But it's all top-down construction, the fact that we can interpret these differently and call them different systems. And, I think that point is right in some sense. Like, there is certainly a level of top-down categorization for us to be able to make any predictions about the world and understand anything at all, but it also doesn't mean that the qualitative distinctions wouldn't exist without that human perception. So that was the point for me. It was almost like a not disagreeing about the nature of the separate brain systems, but disagreeing if we're going so far as to be willing to say there are innately different sensory systems, which no one seems to have a problem with, and innately different affective systems. And if you want to take the constructionist view and go full hardcore and say no distinctions exist other than what humans can perceive and construct, then it should apply to sensory systems as well. And if you are willing to call those innate and categorically distinct, then emotions are just the same. Does that sound like a right summary?
I agree. I agree completely. And I want to be sure that our viewers or listeners are focusing on the part of what you said that I focused on, because I think that's the really important part. So let me say it in two different ways. The one is to say that, of course, it's true that the visual, somatosensory, auditory, olfactory, etc., sensory systems are not absolutely categorically distinct from each other. That there's no overlap in their neural architecture. By the way, sorry, this is still my first point. So Lisa makes that point. She says, see, the visual, even these basic sensory systems are not really categorically distinct innately. I'm going to come to the second point about the innate bit. They overlap with each other. You get occipital, so-called unimodal cortex, visual cortex. You get cells firing in response to auditory stimuli. So clearly, these things overlap with each other. They're not categorical. She says we claim about basic emotions that they are so categorical that they are neurons which are dedicated to fear, and they have nothing to do with the neurons that are dedicated to rage, which have nothing to do with the neurons that are dedicated to lust. That's not what we say. We say, yeah, of course, they're overlapping systems in the same way as our different sensory systems overlap. But this is the second point. That doesn't mean that it's not useful to speak about a system that we're born with. I mean, it's absurd to say we're not born with a visual system. We're not born with an auditory system. We're not born with an olfactory system. And if your concept requires us to throw out all of that.
Just for a second,
Yeah,
I think we're good
sorry
now.
about that. Yeah, I think that's not a useful philosophy. Even if you can defend it philosophically, it's not practically useful when doing neuroscience. Now, the second point, the other thing that Lisa says is that if you are born with congenital cataracts, so your visual system never receives any visual input, then the occipital cortex will be used for other purposes. And that also I know is true. Likewise with our innate emotional systems. If you're born into such a weird environment that nothing frightening ever happens, you've never, ever experienced a single danger, your fear system is going to wither. And those neurons are going to be taken over. They're going to do other things because there's no need for them to register fear. I completely agree with that too. So for me, the bottom line is the following, that people who say, I'm persuaded by Lisa's arguments that there is no such thing as a fear system and no such thing as a rage system and no such thing as a lust system, they must know that those arguments are only claiming that there are no such systems in the same way as we can claim there's no visual system, there's no auditory system, there's no somatosensory system. The evidence that she provides and the arguments that she uses is on that level. And I think, well, yeah, okay, if you want to use that evidence to throw out the concept uh, of fear and rage, you must also throw out the concept, of vision and hearing, and say these are not innate things. These are just constructs. They're a product of.
I think these debates are all stemming out of a much deeper problem in philosophy of science, postmodernism, and the nature of categorization. You see the same thing really everywhere. I mean, to talk about very broadly how most fields of science operate, I think every empirical field, you're gathering data and you're not able to say this data conclusively predicts. You're just concluding probabilities. And at some point, you reach an overwhelming amount of evidence that this is extremely unlikely to have occurred by chance. And if you get a lot of evidence like that, you just make the leap into saying, this is as if we have a categorical judgment that this is absolutely true because it's so unlikely to be false. So you still could criticize, well, it's all probabilistic. And you could say the same thing even about our conscious experience. Like we perceive the world as if it's objective. And really, if you're talking about basic sensory systems and sensory input, it's like it's all prediction, but some things out in the world are giving us such stable input that we can just assume that it's constant and real, right? And you see this even in biology, like the idea of a species, it doesn't really exist in any true sense. Like if you want to just think about stripping all categories away, life is this continuous evolved process. At some point, you do get enough divergence that species can't mate with each other. But sometimes we have these not completely arbitrary, but human decided coding schemes for, say, how different a set of fossils have to be from a different set that we're willing to call it a different species. And you even see it with sex and gender, which is so interesting because, as you know, Mark, I studied brain development in kids with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, an intersex disorder where females have heightened levels of prenatal androgens like testosterone and they're masculinized. And most of the time, they still identify as female, but in extreme cases, you can see ambiguous genitalia and real intersex presentation. But that doesn't mean that this categorical distinction between male and female doesn't exist. The really interesting thing to me is that some people look at evidence like that and say, because there's not a clear-cut boundary, because there are a variety of intersex disorders and a variety of methods of categorization that always aren't so clear-cut, that the concept itself of binary sex isn't scientifically valid. But you don't see the same argument being made for the concept of species. And if there's a more fundamental biological concept, set of biological categories, sex is way more fundamental than species. But you don't see people saying we should therefore strip away this whole idea of categorization in science because it's all probabilistic.
Yeah, well, you put it beautifully. Um, I have nothing to add. I completely agree with you.
Well, thank you. Um, we haven't talked about dreams at all, which I know you've spent decades studying and really massively influenced the way you think about consciousness.
So the brain mechanisms of dreaming, uh, the dawn of the science of the neuroscience of dreaming was the observation in the early 1950s that we have cyclical arousal of our brains, which we nowadays call REM sleep. And the not unreasonable hypothesis arose that during this paradoxical arousal of the brain during sleep, there might be this might be the physiological correlate of dreaming because it has the same paradoxical uh, thing that you're unconscious and yet you're dreaming. So you're not unconscious, and so the brain is sleeping and yet it's aroused. maybe during those arousal cycles called REM, that's when we're dreaming. And so easily tested, you wake people up in REM and you wake people up out of REM, and the prediction is that they'll be dreaming during REM and not during non-REM, and that's what was found. 90% roughly of awakenings from REM lead to dream reports, and 10% roughly from non-REM lead to dream reports. On that basis, the two things were assumed to be one and the same. And then the search for the brain mechanisms producing this phenomenon was relegated to animal research, where, of course, you can't monitor the dreams, but you can monitor the REM sleep. And why did they move to animal research? It's because they wanted to systematically damage the brain to see which part, when damaged, leads to a loss of REM. That was identified, mesopontine tegmentum. Cholinergic cells in the mesopontine tegmentum drive REM. And so it was assumed that this structure drives dreams. But as I said, this was found in cats and rats, where you can't see what's going on with their dreams. So my research started from that point, where I didn't study cats and rats, but rather human beings. And obviously I didn't lesion them, but rather waited for accidents of nature, strokes and tumors and the like, to occur in these structures. And what I found was, to my absolute astonishment, because I wasn't expecting it, it wasn't a prediction of mine, I wasn't even studying this question. I won't bother you with the details of why I did the research, but I accidentally found that patients of mine who had damage in the mesopontine tegmentum and who lost REM sleep, they were still dreaming. And I thought, what's going on here? How can that be? You know? And the first one who told me they were dreaming, of course, I didn't believe them. And then the next one and the next one, and then I had 18 of them. And simultaneously, as I was discovering, wow, you can have no REM sleep and you can still dream, I was discovering another group of patients who continued to have REM sleep but stopped dreaming. So that showed, and they had lesions in consistently the same places. So that showed that dreaming and REM sleep were doubly dissociable. That's a basic paradigm in my field, in neuropsychology. If you lose structure A, and that leads to the loss of function A, but function B is preserved, and you lose structure B, and you lose function B, but function A is preserved, these are two different functions. They're not the same thing. Speaking of categories. And they're not the same thing. And so the interesting thing is, where were the lesions that led to loss of dreaming with preservation of REM sleep? Those lesions were in a dopaminergic pathway from the ventral tegmental area up into the nucleus accumbens and other forebrain structures, mainly frontal structures. So that was the basis of all my work in brain mechanisms of dreaming, was me realizing that the brain mechanisms of REM sleep are not the mechanisms of dreaming, that these things correlate with each other. They're not the same thing. And secondly, that the thing that drives dreaming is the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine system. And that has interesting implications for our understanding of what dreams are. Why do we dream? By the way, there still remains the big question of, why do they correlate, REM sleep and dreaming? And that you said, where should we begin? I think let's begin there. That's what I found. Where should we go next in relation to this?
There are a couple of interesting assumptions that you see, particularly among philosophers who are talking about consciousness and unconsciousness, and sleep being conscious if you're dreaming and unconscious if not. And tying this back earlier to what we were talking about, the subliminal priming studies, the idea that you can have something that's a perception that's not consciously accessible, but does have, in the more broad way of defining conscious, an experiential effect, even if it's just a subtle influence on your affect that you can't register. My guess is we would say that sleep when you're dreaming is consciously accessible, but what we call unconscious sleep isn't really unconscious. There is something that it's like to be someone who's asleep and not dreaming, but it's just not metacognitive. Is that right?
Yeah, but I think in broad brushstrokes, yes, I agree with you. But there's some interesting little empirical aspect to this, that even in the so-called unconscious part of sleep, there's some metacognition going on a lot of the time. Why I say that is that if you wake people up, as I've done more times than I'd like to remember in a sleep lab, um, and you say to them, "Were you dreaming?" And they say yes or no, that's a binary that they were conscious or they were not conscious. Um, but if you say to them, "What was passing through your mind just before I woke you up?" then they don't say nothing. Some of the time they say nothing, but a lot of the time they say, "I was thinking," in non-REM sleep. Um, and the thinking has a kind of a stereotyped sort of obsessive compulsive quality to it. People are ruminating a lot of the
Hmm.
time when they're asleep. And if you wake them up in the middle of that rumination, they still remember it. They say, "Oh, I was thinking about where am I going to park tomorrow," or something like that. But it's not a dream. They're not hallucinating. They're not deluded. They're not in some uh, non-existent reality. They're thinking about real world things in a kind of low grade way.
And what's going on when you're taking real sensory input, but not waking up and incorporating it into your dream? Whether you're hearing a sound and the sound somehow makes it into the dream, or you start to have to go to the bathroom, but not enough to wake you up, but in the dream, you feel that you have to go until eventually you wake up and realize it's a real urge.
Yeah. So this is definitely a thing that happens. This is well studied and well demonstrated that such things do happen. So this is the kind of I mean, what's interesting to me about both of the questions that we're busy discussing is, what does it tell us about why do we dream? Because I think that's a fascinating question. I just want to pause for a moment um, and remark on how extraordinary it is that we dream. It's the most amazing thing. Every night you make up this incredibly complicated world that just isn't there. And you do it a lot. 20% of your sleep. You're dreaming, and what the hell is going on there? Why does that happen? And most of us, if we do remember a dream, we sort of vaguely know actually that um, that oil container, I'm thinking of an actual dream that happened last night. That oil container that I dreamt I was drinking out of, I saw the empty vessel of that in the dustbin yesterday. Now, why do I dream of myself drinking out of it tonight? I don't know. But you can see these things come from somewhere. They got some connection to what's going on, in your daily life. So I think it's just a truly fascinating question. So that's the pause. Just sort of saying, I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating. So now the things you're talking about, like subliminal stimuli being incorporated into the dream, or things being incorporated into the dream subliminally. That's what you're saying. You're not aware, oh, I need to urinate, but the need that you have to urinate leads to your dreaming that you are urinating, say, getting rid of that need. That phenomenon. And the other thing that you were talking about earlier about, are we conscious in what does it mean to say we're conscious when we're dreaming? What does it mean to say we are not conscious when we're not dreaming? Um, I think both of those things is that they lead to the fact that we do have sleep punctuated by intense consciousness. Um, why does that happen? And the fact that these stimuli from memory or from while you're sleeping get incorporated in the dream. what do these two things tell us about why we dream, what dreaming is for? That for me is the interesting part of it. And remember what we said at the beginning of our conversation today. We were talking about, what consciousness is for, and it's what the basic form of consciousness is. And I'm saying it's raw feeling is the basic form of consciousness, and it is basically a need state. It's a problem, and that's feeling, and then it leads to, it's a demand for work, for mental work, and then it leads to this mental work, which is predictive work. How do I optimize my predictive model so as to meet my needs, so as to not have these bad feelings? That's basically how the mind works. Um, and what comes to consciousness is an unsolved problem. Basically, that's what we're saying. I don't know how I've got this feeling, and now I need to feel my way through it. In other words, I need to think about it and solve it. Um, I think that's what dreaming is. Dreaming is that the reason we become conscious while we're asleep is because we have problems while we're asleep that we need to solve. Mental solutions are required. It's a demand on the mind for work while we're sleeping. And so it needs to feel its way through the problem. And that's, to me, if everything else I've learned about feelings is right, then, and about consciousness, which to me is, the basic form of which is feeling, then it follows that dreams are an attempt to do, it's doing some sort of mental work to solve some sort of problem. And what we know from tons of evidence of a different kind is that memory consolidation is going on during sleep.
Mhm.
There's just no question about it that sleep is when we consolidate what we learned during the day. And so this thing about subliminal stimuli, whether they're present or past, they are. Um, I like to link that to this whole business that we're busy sifting through our um, representations of what happened today. In other words, our what we've learned in any day is what prediction errors occurred today, what things
Mhm.
happened that weren't expected. The things that were expected, they ignored. They're not things. They didn't happen as far as your mind's concerned. They were entirely uh, sort of airbrushed out. What remains is what was information. What was unexpected. So that's what memory consolidation is all about. It's all about sifting through the prediction errors of the day. You can't update your predictive model willy-nilly every single time. Every single tiny prediction error leads to an update. You have a massively overly complex predictive model if that's the case. So it's some kind of consolidation involves, what am I going to forget and what am I going to retain? What I'm going to retain means what am I going to give up in terms of my old predictions? So it's quite a complicated business going on during sleep. So the conflict, if you will, is between what do I retain of my old predictive model and what do I have to abandon in order to take account of the prediction errors of the day. That, I think, is the problem solving that goes on during sleep. And when it becomes conscious, it is that business of actually doing the work. So that's now there's a feeling of don't like that. This in relation to one or another of the many affective domains, and then the dream is an attempt to solve that problem. That's the best guess, and that is nothing more than a guess. I have to tell you that I can make about what goes on, what's going on in the dreaming brain in relation to the various concepts that we've been discussing in this conversation. Um,
Your work, Mark, and particularly the broader introduction to predictive processing as a way of thinking about consciousness, really helped piece together a bunch of counterintuitive findings from my introductory cognitive neuroscience education. One was Dan Schachter's work on memory and imagination, showing that they rely on the same neural systems, which is kind of strange. But when you think about, like you said, memory is for predicting the future, then no wonder when you're imagining a scene from your past, it's basically the same as lighting up your sensory system to visualize this internal world the same way you would when you're imagining or when you're dreaming. And then that pieced together very nicely with the standard take of dreaming is just memory consolidation plus other things. It's interesting because this could just be biased by what I'm remembering, but what I was taught about how dreaming works and why we dream, there was one extreme, which was the very cognitive take, which is it's just memory consolidation and the rest is noise. And then the other take, which is really just taught as a historical thing that's kind of dismissed, is the psychoanalyst take. And I always thought there was something in between those. Clearly, there's the memory consolidation aspect, not just because of all the research that's gone into it, but anecdotally, sometimes I see random details in my dream, like you just mentioned, you experienced last night, details about something you experienced during the day that somehow makes it into your dream, even if it's insignificant. But then dreams also have this broader narrative. And like you mentioned, it's often goal directed. And it seems like it's involved in some sort of problem you're trying to solve. And I know you've been involved in revitalizing this psychoanalytic perspective. It's been maybe treated too harshly in the last century.
Yeah, just in relation to what you said about the purely cognitive picture, that all it's just memory consolidation and the rest is noise. Uh, that whenever I'm told that, I ask my colleague, and why do we have to be conscious of it? Because surely the most fundamental property of a dream is that it's a conscious mental state. So what is consciousness doing in this memory consolidation picture? And then it goes back to all of the things that we were just discussing. You're asking me about Freud. Um, you know, Sorry, I just want to say to you, Adam, I think I can go for about 5 minutes more because I need to have a little gap before my next meeting, if that's all right with
Sure.
you.
All
Okay.
right.
Um, the the thing about Freud is that people are either card carrying Freudians. It's like some kind of cult or religion or something that they that they are signing up to, um, or they think that Freud is must be cancelled. And I don't understand that. It's like, to me, Freud is to psychology um, like Darwin is to, you know, evolutionary biology, or modern molecular evolutionary biology, and Newton is to physics, or to contemporary, like, quantum physics. Newton knew nothing about quantum physics. That doesn't
And he
mean
was
we
also
cannot.
an alchemist. The interesting thing is
Yes,
a lot of
exactly.
our
Yeah,
historical geniuses, they were pretty eccentric and they get some things wrong.
yeah, sure. And there's a hell of a lot that Darwin didn't know, and that he got wrong. So I think Freud was a pioneer. He showed some really important basic things about how the mind works. He got a hell of a lot of detail wrong, and there were some basic things he got wrong too. So I'm not, I'm trying to have a more balanced. But why do I bother with Freud at all? It's because there are things that I think are lacking in neuroscience, that we can import some ideas of Freud's into neuroscience and enrich neuroscience. That was I didn't start out as a psychoanalyst. I started out as a neuroscientist who was frustrated by what's missing in neuro, especially when I trained, which was in the 1980s. There was just no mind there. And the interesting thing about the brain is that it has this subjective aspect. It's fascinating. It's extraordinary. What is the subjectivity for? What does it do? And when I was young, if you ask questions like that of your professors, they said, "Don't ask questions like that. It's bad for your career." That was literally what was said to me. So I think, uh, remember, I'm talking about the 1980s. The whole importance of subjectivity. In other words, what is it like to be a brain? Why is there something it's like to be a brain? What is consciousness for? Why does feeling play such a fundamentally important part in our mental lives? Can you understand cognition at all if you don't understand it's in the service of meeting our needs? And so Freud's whole, what we nowadays call embodied cognition, this was the kind of thing that he pioneered. Um, this idea that the mind is performing a task on behalf of the organism. He was a biologist of the mind. He sort of incorporated subjectivity into science and into neuroscience. And because he had terms and concepts, psychoanalysts have a language for these sorts of things that we don't even or didn't even talk about in neuropsychology and cognitive neuroscience, such as it was in the 1980s. That's what I thought. I thought, we must bring these things in. It enriches our field. I also, in doing that, in other words, trying to bring these concepts into neuroscience means finding their physiological and anatomical realizations. Once you do that, you necessarily have a two-way street. You also then can use all the tools of neuroscience to correct theoretical, to develop psychoanalytical theory for psychoanalysts, because as I said, many of them are not interested in evidence. That's not. I think that what we want is an objective science of subjectivity. We want to incorporate subjectivity into objective science, and it's been a very pleasurable journey for me to have been doing that for the last, 40 years.
That's a great place to close. Thank you very much for your time, Mark. And like I said, it's been so influential on me in this early stage of neuroscience training.
I'm very, very glad to hear that, Adam, and I always enjoy speaking to you very much.
Likewise.
Thanks for your interest. Cheers.